The Square Ball Podcast.
Welcome to the show. Welcome to the West Stand. Dan here with Michael, and we welcome back out of retirement, sadly under the circumstances, but it's lovely to have you back. Phil Hay, welcome.
Hello, thank you.
We're here to talk about Sol Bamba, and I reached out to you in the wake of his passing because you wrote the article on The Athletic about knowing him and building a friendship with him, and his untimely death. And it's a really, really good article. Would urge anybody to go and read it who hasn't yet. And just wondered if you wanted to come in and just have a chat about that and tell us a bit more about him, because you're probably the person that we know anyway who would have known him best. So do you want to just sort of talk us through the article and your relationship with Sol?
Yeah, there are plenty of people who knew Sol better than me and were closer to him than me, but I got to know him first when he came to Leeds United, in that very sort of standard journalist footballer relationship, but got to know him better really after he left the club, when you can be a bit more casual with people, and then better again after he retired. We kept in touch pretty regularly. He was very, very helpful when it came to articles that we were writing. He was really knowledgeable as well, and I always felt quite open and brave in what he was prepared to say. If you asked Bamba questions, he would never take umbrage with a question, but he would answer in his own way, and he'd tell you as he wanted you to hear it. And he had a lot going on. I think when I heard the news on Sunday, first thought was really of his family. He was only 39, and he leaves behind kids and his wife Chloe as well. And that's tough at any age, but I think tough particularly when you are so young. I think we could probably all relate to that. But I was thinking as well about the last couple of conversations I'd had with him. One of them just before Christmas last year. He was emptying his diary and creating space because he was wanting to do his UEFA Pro licence, and that's a qualification course that runs over a sustained period of time. So you have to find regular weeks and weekends and other periods in the year to do the coursework and to do the practical work and everything else. And he was dead set on getting that, and dead set on getting that on his CV. And then the last time was around about the African Cup of Nations, when he was, I think, more involved with the Ivory Coast coaching team than people realised. He was quite close to all that as it was going on. You remember that they sacked a coach midway through the tournament and then went on to win it, which he was delighted about. But again, there'd been a bit of talk about him potentially getting more involved there and everything else. And I just felt with Bamba that there was a lot more for him to do, a lot more that he would have wanted to do. There's a lot more for him to give. And I think above all, and you guys will totally relate to this, he was just such an easy guy to love. Like, I was talking a lot about the kind of like most infectious or warmest smile in football, and that was totally Bamba. The photographs of him and the sort of, I was saying on the Athletics podcast, the barometer on social media from Sunday onwards was great, because he was a good defender with Sol, but he was a lovely, lovely bloke, and everybody really was talking about the type of bloke he was.
So how did that friendship and that relationship start to build then? Can you remember a point where you kind of realised, this is a bloke I'd have a pint with, and I quite like just having a chat to him about football?
Well, we'll come to this, but there were obviously the two interviews that he did, and they weren't specifically with me. They were done in huddles with other journalists at the end of two seasons, 2015, 2016, when he was really, really open about the management of the club and what was going on at Elland Road, and we should definitely get into that. But the first time I really interviewed him at length was just after he left, and if you remember, 2017, he was out of the picture at the end of that transfer window. Leeds had signed Kyle Bartley and they'd signed Pontus Jansson. And I don't think we should necessarily gloss over the defender that Bamba was. I think at that point, it was better for Leeds to have Jansson and Bartley as the partnership at centre-back than it was to have Bamba in there. But the fly in the ointment was that Bamba was club captain. And as he saw it, it made it pretty awkward for Gary Monk and for the club to have him in the background, in the dressing room, as a club captain who wanted to play and couldn't play. And I think he thought that it might lead to friction, it might make things difficult. So he and the club agreed that he'd sever his contract. And I interviewed him about a week after that to basically ask why, because it hadn't really been explained when he left. And he went into it in great detail, and he did just say, they really didn't need me hanging about in the background, even though I didn't particularly want to go. And from there, we just started to keep in touch. And if there were articles that he could help with, or bits of background on things that had happened at Leeds under Cellino, for example, he was always really helpful with that. But I think a couple of abiding memories of him at Leeds, but the biggest one for me would be that game when he was at Cardiff City, that game down in Cardiff, 2017, when Thomas Christensen was manager. And you might remember it as that really wet night where Matthias Cleek slipped in the passage leading to their first goal. There was a bit of an argument about the boots that Cleek had picked that night. Thomas Christensen seemed to take the hump with him immediately, never played him again, and Cleek was gone on loan in January. And we thought, wrongly, that was the end of Cleek at Leeds, and obviously then came back and was mega under Bielsa. But that night, Warnock decided to play Bamba as a holding midfielder in front of the back four. And whatever else he was, Bamba, he was definitely not a central midfielder. So we got the team sheets, and after a bit of time, we kind of deduced that was probably what was happening. And he had a great game that night. He just pulled the strings and he ran everything. So I drove home that evening, got in early, and then the next morning, I messaged him and I said, fucking hell, I didn't realise Cardiff had signed Busquets. And he messaged back and he said, well, I'm hoping I never play there again, because if I do, people will find out I'm useless in that position. But you know how it is. Over time, you just start to keep in touch. You start to chat on about things. He was always a really good sounding board for how dressing rooms worked, or, how footballers think. He was always very happy to speak about that stuff. He spoke really strongly on the Black Lives Matters issue as well. The question of taking the knee. I phoned him. We wanted to do a big piece on it. I phoned him and said, what do you think? And again, he was kind of brutally honest about it. He said, I'm not so sure that it's going to achieve anything. It might look good and it might last for a while, but it'll probably dissipate somewhere down the line. And when it does, what's it actually achieved? I'd prefer to see some actual, proper, tangible action, as opposed to something which people are quite happy to do and takes 5 seconds at the start of a game, but doesn't really have any positive consequences long term. So yeah, it became that sort of relationship. And he'd been at Hibs, so I used to rib him about that from time to time. And he was just a fun bloke. Always in the best of moods. You'd phone him up and you'd say to him, how's it going? And he'd always say to you, oh, good, mate, good, regardless of whether he was. And I think clearly over the last 3 or 4 months, he wasn't doing well. But I must confess, I had no idea he was struggling again, and no idea that he was ill. And it was a big, big shock on Sunday.
What do you remember from his time at Leeds, Michael?
Chaos for the most part. Not all of it Sol Bamba's fault, it must be said. Although he did like a run forward, which did...
He had the occasional moment, didn't he?
It did leave you going, oh, God, just pass it now. There's a big gap. But he was actually, given the time at Leeds, it was pure chaos, the era there. It was prime Chileno time. There was a churn of management that was on a different scale. And Bamba was, for as much as he was a bit of a unorthodox defender, so we'll call him, he was a good player for us. And someone who I think, as much as anything at that time, he was important as a presence who would speak out against the ownership and the general chaos going on, because it's very, very easy to just bat those questions away and try to pretend that that's not happening and say, look, I'm just a footballer. I'm just here to play. Whereas you clearly, in that environment, to ignore the stuff going on around you is ridiculous. But he just always faced it head on.
Yeah, he was always very happy to be political. Or happy is probably the wrong word. He was always very willing to be political. I was thinking back to that Chileno era and trying to remember exactly what type of club it was. And it was a sort of place where managers just got sacked all the time. Chileno spent time away because he's been banned by the Football League. EFL, as it is now, from owning the club. The thing I'd forgotten about, Ducara getting banned for 9 games for biting somebody, Amora Bieta at Fulham, and then just returning, going back into the squad and nobody saying a word about it. It was just like, oh, well, ban served, on we go. But the Ducara thing actually is quite relevant because around that time, it was a big culture war at Leeds. You had a lot of people, me included, who didn't think very highly of Chileno and were critical of a lot of what he was doing. And the YEP followed that line as well, largely because I was writing for them. But you also had a chunk of supporters who were massively pro-Chileno. And if they wouldn't hear a bad word, if it wasn't so much like wouldn't hear a bad word about him, were very resistant to the negative coverage of him. I think, did that not spawn the hashtag GGBT, get behind the team? Oh, GBTT, yeah, as you coined it. And I don't know whether you remember, but the guy who tweeted me one night in the midst of the Ducara stuff,
I know where this is going.
maybe Amora be a bit himself, you know. And that's,
has anyone taken an impression of his teeth in the camp?
And that's what it was. And for what it's worth, Ross McCormack was in that Fulham team, and he said to me further down the line, you know, that was really bad, that actually, when he came in and we saw it. So Ducara denied doing it for, just for the sake of being fair to him. Who knows? But the FA did they charge him with him and ban him. But somebody on Twitter who was very pro Chilino did say, you know, maybe Amora Bieta bit himself, and that was the stage at which it got to. It was so polarised. So actually, from our point of view, it was really refreshing for a footballer to come out and say, no, do you know what? Somebody in the Leeds dressing room to say, it's not good enough, this. It's not going anywhere. The management need to get a grip, and we need some proper direction, and we need some proper, sensible decisions that are going to let us grow as a team. And I think what you have to remember is that second time round when Bamba did that, and that was at the point where Steve Evans was going, he was under contract at Leeds, so he was protected in that sense. But the first time he did it in 2015, and that was when Redfern was on his way out, he was on loan from Palermo. And he desperately wanted to join Leeds. He wanted to get a contract, but he knew that it wasn't guaranteed, and there was nothing agreed at that point. So it was a big risk in that sense, and there was every chance that Chilino was going to listen to what he said, and you know, bin him there and then. But I often wondered whether Chilino quite actually admired seeing somebody speaking like that. You know, just
I saw you write in the article. I read that and I thought, do you know what? He's got a really good point there.
Yeah,
actually,
whether
maybe,
he listened to Bamba and thought, do you know, I quite admire his bollocks, really. And also whether actually with Chilino, if you fronted him up, he was, you know, he was less inclined to do to you what he might do than if you just sat back and took it. And I think that was Bamba's point of view. What is the point in being here if it's going to be like this, you know? And then what's the point in pretending that this is really good when it isn't? And just to touch on something Michael said, you know, I totally agree about Bamba. The bomb scare runs forward, actually, when you look back, were really funny. And I kind of love that about football from time to time. But in that first season, when there was a real risk of them going down under Redfern, he was actually pretty immense in a poor team.
I suppose when someone like Bamba speaks out like that, it's an indication that they're setting a benchmark. They want the standards to be higher at the club. So in turn, the fans will latch onto that because it gives fans hope of a better day, of saying this isn't good enough. It needs to improve. We need to have a little bit, I suppose it's a bit more nobility as a club is what Leeds fans are always searching for in that era. So to have somebody come out and say, no, this ain't good enough. We deserve better.
I think I felt a sadness when I saw the video of him scoring that brilliant goal against Wolves. It was someone filming it from behind the goal. It's an amazing goal.
Absolutely pinpoint that, isn't it?
But it's in an end of season, pretty much a dead rubber in front of about, I've not checked the attendance, it looks like probably 17,000, 18,000 people. And that's kind of the position we were in now. It's almost unthinkable to have such a low crowd at Ellen Road. Like even League Cup games are selling out. But at that era, that was just what it was. And it made me feel a little bit sad that Bamba wasn't here for a better time when we could have actually appreciated it and there should have been 37,000 people enjoying that goal, whereas it was a bit of a, bloody hell. It was a bit like when Ducara scored that one. It was almost funny when people used to score good goals at Ellen Road at that time because it was such a rarity. It was like, fucking, we actually see something good for a change.
It's a bit of a contradiction, isn't it? Because there's that part of me that wonders if Bamba was good enough for Leeds to go forward in the way that they needed to. And as I say, you know, compared to, say, Janssen and Bartley, you didn't feel like you betrayed neither of them. Compared to, like Ben White, for example, in the promotion team, it wasn't as if you would have been taking White out and putting Bamba in. But then at the same time, he was part of a team who got promoted at Cardiff, and he did play in the Premier League for them. And he was a very good footballer, you know, accomplished centre-back, strong guy, brave guy, a lot of caps for the Ivory Coast. But that's how it was at Leeds. And I think you saying about somebody, you know, speaking out, somebody who's inside the building, I think it helps beyond that if it's somebody who's genuinely popular, which Bamba was, and it is, you know, genuinely front and centre. I think it makes it very difficult for the club to ignore it, and it's hard for, you know, the people who were around the club at that time. I think it was Andrew Umbers who was running it in Chilino's absence, but it's hard for anybody else to say, no, actually things are really good here, when the thing you can throw back at them straight away is, well, your captain doesn't think so. You know, your captain thinks the complete opposite. So which is it?
Yeah, 17,694 the attendance.
That's terrible, isn't it?
Tuesday, the 19th of April, it was. I looked at the day because I wondered if that was a midweek fixture, because that always tended to dent things, didn't it? Yeah.
Totally understandable though, because what were you selling at that point?
Well, you've got give or take 500 away fans there, so just a fraction over 17,000 only 8 years ago.
Yeah, was that the Pie-Tax period? I can't remember. There was so much madness during that
Pie-Tax was
period.
around about that, but also it was the Sick Note 6 era, or heading in that direction. I mean, interestingly, and I suppose this kind of proves that he wasn't so much playing to the crowd, Bamba, as saying what he thought. I did ask him about the Sick Note 6 after he left, and he said, I think the easy thing to have done would have been to give them a bit of a going over and, as I say, play to the crowd slightly. But he said, look, they never said to me that's what they were doing. I was never told specifically that that's what they're doing. I know how it looks. I know what people think. I'm not telling them they're wrong. But all I'm saying is I'm not going to slate them on the basis that I don't actually know for sure,
I've still never forgiven Dario Del Fabro.
I thought you might not have done.
Can you remember who the other scorer was on the night?
I looked this up the other day and I can't.
2-2 for this particular midfielder.
I haven't looked at this, but I do know who it is. Yeah,
is it Liam Britcott or someone?
Diagaraga.
Yeah.
So we beat Reading 3-2 in the game that preceded this one. Presumably it must have been around Easter, because the games are coming pretty thick and fast in the calendar at this
I think
point.
so. Was it pre or after Charlton away? Sick Note 6 day.
So the Charlton away game was after that, in which Bamba scored as well.
Yes.
Yeah, so it was 3 wins on the bounce. Birmingham away, we won 2-1. Stuart Dallas scored both goals. And then we beat Reading 3-2 at home. And then we beat Wolves 2-1 at home. Went to Hull, drew 2-2. And then it was Sick Note 6 game, back end of April.
It's interesting to talk about him as a footballer, to say whether or not he would have been good enough for the Premier League, because he did get there before us. And if you look back at some of that Leeds squad that he was with, you would have equally said it was very unlikely that Liam Cooper and Stuart Dallas and Calvin Phillips were ever going to play in the Premier League as well. So he maybe could have done in different circumstances, I suppose, because he did for Cardiff. And
it's true. And also in a squad that was actually built with some form of sense and, some structure would have made a really, really big difference. On his day, I remember one.
I got the games the wrong way around, I think, by the way. It was a Charlton away game, wasn't it?
Was it the previous season?
Could have been.
I think it was. I think Wolves. Yeah. It was Wolves in the Steve Evans season, and I think Charlton was definitely the Neil Redfern.
It's so much has happened. Honestly, it's absolute chaos. But it was
one of those periods you try to relegate from your mind.
So but we drew there. It was around December. That's that Christmas-ish.
I do remember a mega performance from him at Middlesbrough. That game that Leeds won, where Moet scored early on, and those results were so critical in keeping them up, which I genuinely doubted. After that game at the turn of the year when they went to Derby and seemed to play the whole of it either in or beside their own box and got beat 2-0, came away from that thinking they're going down here.
We were absolutely feeding on scraps.
That was unbelievable that night. You just thought, I don't even know what remotely to cling to here. And they dug themselves out of it pretty brilliantly. The change to one up top made a difference, but so did having somebody like Bamba in the defence. And it wasn't a surprise that captaincy gravitated towards him. He was really, really perfect candidate for him. Weirdest thing about Bamba, I found this the first time I spoke to him. He obviously grew up in Paris, right? And he was of African descent, and he played in Turkey and he played in Italy before he came to England. But he'd also been up with Dunfermline and Hibs up in Scotland. And the first time I spoke to him, I thought to myself, you sound like you're from Edinburgh, you. And he did have this like Edinburgh lilt that was always there. So when you spoke to him and you said, how you doing? I sound, mate, sound. It's like...
It's funny.
Obviously, if he was taking the piss.
I was going to say, just looking through his career history to come through the youth team at PSG, and then he played one senior game between 2004 and 2006 for PSG, and then the next one on the CV is Dunfermline.
Yeah.
It's quite a move.
He's almost a bit of a prototype Luke Ayling in that respect, isn't he? Someone who started at a big club but then dropped right down Scottish football.
Yeah. Not just Scottish football, Dunfermline. Yeah.
But then actually when he got to the Premier League, even though it was for Cardiff and even though it was for Neil Warnock, there was a bit of you just went, oh, that's nice for him. He kind of deserves his go at it.
But he's a properly likeable guy, wasn't he? And even when you phoned him up, I did that interview with him after he was diagnosed with form of cancer, and he just sort of said, "Yeah, I just need to get through this so I can sort out another year at Cardiff and carry on playing." And you're a bit like, how are you feeling though? Oh, yeah, fine, you know. And he obviously wasn't. I mean, like there've been periods of that where it would have been really tough and really like physically draining. But the really sad thing about that is that you recall him tweeting saying, I've had the news that I'm cancer free, and you thought, well, that's absolutely great. And I don't know whether this has been the same form of it, but his wife posted on Instagram on Sunday and seemed to very much imply that it had been all part of the same issue, all part of the same illness that had just caught up with him in the end. But Dunfermline, I think, is probably a great example of what he liked to do, which was just to get out there and have adventures, a bit like his bursts from the edge of the box to 10 yards outside the opposition box, liked to see what was out there, wanted to coach in the Ivory Coast, went to Turkey to do some coaching, wanted to get his UEFA Pro licence. He never struck me as somebody who was going to spend his years after football kicking his heels.
Yeah, English, French, Italian, Turkish and Ivorian dialect that his father used at home. So says Wikipedia. I know it's not necessarily the most reliable source, but it's pretty wild, is that? That is getting out there and getting after it.
Yeah, clever guy.
Yeah, it's interesting how he has remained representative of kind of like a shining light. And I likened him when we spoke a little bit earlier in the week to having a similar sort of impact to Vinnie Jones around at Leeds for about the same period of time, a season and a bit, but is really fondly remembered for his contribution to that time. And as we said, it was a time of real chaos at Leeds, but still held in high regard. And as you were saying, there's a little fondness there that carries on even when you go off to other clubs and you think, I kind of want you to be all right in your career. And you don't say that of many players. They come and they go, and players are peripheral. But with Sol Bamba, you did cling on to that a bit.
Yeah, and he joined in difficult circumstances, and he left on it was difficult for him, but from the club's point of view, he made it very easy, didn't he? He didn't feel like he was someone who was hanging around too long collecting wages. His performances didn't particularly drop off. There were changes afoot, and he went, you know what? I'll see you later. I'm going to go do something else. I want to go play football.
My reading of it as well is that he properly fought for the crowd in the sense of what he was prepared to say and the way he was prepared to stick his neck out. And I think, and I always say this, if you go back over the last 20 years, there are a hell of a lot of people, coaches, players, senior management, who the crowd would probably say have let them down or haven't contributed anywhere near enough for what they would have wanted to. You've got this much smaller crop of players, coaches and others who have made really big contributions, and you can apply that really to all of the Bielsa squad. But I think Bamba falls into that category as well. When it was a case of who's going to stand up and who's going to be brave, he was, and I think people appreciated that. How
will you remember him then, finally?
Well, it'd be the big smile. He was always happy, was Bamba. Which is like the polar opposite of me, really. But it is the smile. I was digging out that photo that I took of him when I interviewed him after he had his final session of chemotherapy, and it's just broad and it's just infectious, and it just makes you love him. And I will really miss him.
Phil, thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
The Square Ball Podcast.